trails, carrying letters of introduction from physicians across the region. There was Margaret Ashford, a Cincinnati socialite suffering from severe arthritis. Thomas Brennan, a wealthy tobacco merchant from Louisville, whose bones had been shattered in a carriage accident. Sarah and William Mackenzie, an elderly couple seeking relief from the bone diseases that ran in their family. Each patient paid the substantial sum of $50, nearly $2,000 in today's money, for a week-long treatment regimen that involved daily immersion in the spring waters for periods of up to 4 hours. Dr. Hartwell's treatment notes, discovered decades later in a sealed trunk in his Louisville home, reveal a physician growing increasingly excited by what he observed. Patients reported immediate relief from pain. X-ray photographs, a new technology at the time, seemed to show bone density increasing after just days of treatment. But Dr. Hartwell's journal entries from late October tell a different story, one that reveals a growing unease beneath his professional excitement. October 18, 1880. Mrs. Ashford complains that her skin feels unusually tight after today's treatment. Upon examination, I note an unexpected rigidity in the tissues around her joints. The improvement in her arthritis continues, but this side effect bears watching. October 20th, 1880. Several patients report vivid dreams of being underground, surrounded by stone. Mr. Brennan claims he can taste minerals when he sleeps. I have begun to wonder if the psychological effects of the treatment are as significant as the physical ones. October 22nd, 1880. Something is wrong. The water temperature has dropped to 94 degrees, and there is a new taste, bitter, almost metallic. I have ceased treatments pending further investigation, but October 22nd, 1880, was the last entry Dr. Hartwell would ever make. On the morning of October 23rd, Isaiah Porter, one of the mountain guides who had reluctantly agreed to work at the springs, arrived to find the treatment facility empty. The patients' belongings remained in their rooms. Breakfast sat untouched on the dining table. Dr. Hartwell's medical bag lay open beside the spring pool, its contents scattered as if dropped in haste. 29 people had simply vanished without a trace. Porter's account, given to the county sheriff 2 days later, described an eerie scene that haunted him for the rest of his life. The spring water had turned a milky white color and was bubbling as if heated from below. Strange sounds echoed from the cave system. Beneath the spring sounds, he described as like voices calling from underground, but not quite human voices. Most disturbing of all, Porter noticed that the wooden planks around the spring showed what appeared to be human handprints burned into the wood, as if people had gripped the edges while trying to pull themselves from the water. The sheriff's initial investigation was cursory at best. This was remote mountain country in 1880, where disappearances were often attributed to wild animals, accidents, or simply people choosing to vanish into the wilderness. The assumption was that Dr. Hartwell and his patients had met with some mishap while exploring the extensive cave system that lay beneath the springs. But 2 weeks later, a local hunter named Jacob Mills made a discovery that would change everything. Mills had been tracking a wounded deer through the forest when he noticed an opening in the hillside he had never seen before, a cave entrance that seemed to have been recently opened by some underground upheaval. Following the wounded animal into the cave, Mills found himself in a vast underground chamber, lit by an eerie phosphorescent glow from the walls. What he discovered there would haunt him until his death, 40 years later. In the center of the chamber, arranged in a perfect circle around an underground pool of the same milky white water, stood 29 human figures. But these were not the bodies of victims who had died in the caves. These were statues carved from what appeared to be solid limestone, each one depicting a person in their final moments of life, with horrifying accuracy. Mills recognized Dr. Hartwell immediately. The statue captured the physician with his hand outstretched, mouth open in a silent scream, his medical bag clutched against his chest. Margaret Ashford stood frozen with her arms raised above her head as if trying to ward off some invisible threat. Thomas Brennan knelt beside the pool, his stone fingers still touching the water's surface. Every face bore the same expression of absolute terror, and every statue was carved with such precise detail that individual fingernails, fabric textures, even the tears on the faces were visible in the stone. But most unsettling of all was the discovery that these were not statues at all. When Mills touched one of the figures, he realized that beneath the limestone coating was something organic: bone, tissue, clothing. Somehow, the 29 missing people had been transformed into living stone, their bodies replaced by mineral deposits, while maintaining their exact human form. Mills fled the cave and rode straight to the county seat, where he reported his discovery to Sheriff Coleman, right? A practical man who had served in the Civil War and seen his share of strange things. Initially dismissed Mills' story as the ravings of a frightened hunter, but when Mills led a small party back to the cave 3 days later, they found only solid rock. The entrance that Mills swore had been there was gone, sealed by what appeared to be a natural limestone formation that geologists would later determine had been in place for thousands of years. The official report filed by Sheriff Wright stated simply that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell and 28 patients had disappeared while visiting mineral springs in Wolfe County, and that despite extensive searches, no trace of the missing persons had been found. The case was closed and filed away in the county records, where it would remain forgotten for nearly a century. But Jacob Mills never forgot what he had seen. Before his death in 1920, he drew detailed maps of the cave system and wrote lengthy descriptions of each statue he had encountered. These documents, preserved by his family, would eventually make their way to researchers at the University of Kentucky, where they gathered dust until a graduate student named Rebecca Torres discovered them in 1987. Torres was conducting research on Kentucky's historical mineral springs when she came across Mills' account in a collection of local folklore. What caught her attention was not the supernatural elements of the story, but the scientific accuracy of Mills' descriptions of the cave geology and the chemical properties of the water he described. Intrigued, Torres began investigating the documented history of Millfield Springs. What she found in county records, old newspaper archives, and private correspondence painted a picture of a very real medical facility that had operated briefly in 1880 before disappearing from all official records. More importantly, Torres discovered that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell had indeed been a real person, a respected physician whose Louisville practice had mysteriously closed in October 1880. His death certificate, filed weeks after his disappearance, listed the cause of death as complications from travel, but offered no details about when or where he had died. Torres' research revealed that similar disappearances had occurred at other mineral springs across Kentucky and Tennessee during the 1880s, each involving small groups of people who had come seeking medical treatment and had simply vanished without explanation. In every case, the springs in question had later been abandoned, their locations gradually forgotten as local communities avoided areas associated with unexplained disappearances. Most compelling of all, Torres discovered that modern geological surveys of the Wolfe County area had identified unusual mineral deposits in the groundwater deposits that matched the chemical signatures described in Dr. Hartwell's journal entries from 1880. In 1988, Torres convinced the University of Kentucky to fund a small expedition to the Millfield Springs area, using Mills' hand-drawn maps and GPS coordinates derived from 19th century land surveys. The team located what they believed to be the site of Dr. Hartwell's treatment facility. What they found was a small clearing in the forest, where the foundations of wooden buildings were still visible beneath decades of leaf litter and undergrowth. More significantly, they located the spring itself now, reduced to a small seep of crystal clear water emerging from the limestone. Bedrock. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the existence of an extensive cave system beneath the springs, with large chambers that matched Mills' descriptions of the underground space where he claimed to have found the 29 stone figures. But when the team attempted to locate an entrance to the caves, they found only solid rock formations that showed no signs of recent disturbance. Seismic testing suggested that the cave system was sealed at multiple points by limestone formations that would require significant excavation to breach. The water samples taken from the spring revealed mineral concentrations that were unusual but not unprecedented for Kentucky limestone springs. Chemical analysis showed elevated levels of calcium carbonate and trace amounts of metals that could theoretically cause health effects in humans, but nothing that would explain the transformation Mills claimed to have witnessed. Torres published her findings in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1989, presenting the Millfield Springs case as an example of how unexplained historical events could be understood through a combination of geological investigation and archival research. Her conclusion was that Dr. Hartwell and his patients had likely been victims of a cave-in or underground accident, and that Mills' account represented a combination of traumatic hallucination and local folklore, but Torres' rational explanation could not account for several troubling pieces of evidence that emerged in the years following her publication. In 1991, a construction crew working on a new highway through Wolfe County reported discovering human remains in a limestone cave that had been opened during blasting operations. The remains consisted of 29 complete skeletons arranged in a circle around an underground pool, each skeleton surrounded by a thick coating of calcium carbonate deposits that had preserved bone, clothing, and personal effects with extraordinary detailed. Carbon dating of the remains confirmed that they dated to approximately 1880. Personal effects found with the skeletons included medical instruments consistent with Dr. Hartwell's profession, jewelry that matched descriptions of items worn by the missing patients, and clothing styles typical of the late Victorian era. Most unsettling was the discovery that each skeleton showed signs of rapid calcium deposition throughout the bone structure. A process that would normally take centuries had apparently occurred in a matter of days or weeks. The positioning of the skeletons suggested that the individuals had died while trying to escape from the underground chamber, their bodies becoming encased in mineral deposits while they were still alive. The Kentucky State Medical Examiner's office classified the deaths as accidental, resulting from exposure to unusually high concentrations of dissolved minerals in the cave water. The official report suggested that the victims had become trapped in the underground chamber and died from mineral poisoning that caused rapid ossification of their tissues. But the medical examiner's report could not explain how 29 people had accessed an underground chamber that showed no signs of any entrance, or why their remains had been arranged in such a precise circular pattern around the underground pool. The discovery made headlines in Kentucky newspapers for several weeks, but the story gradually faded from public attention as other news took precedence. The remains were quietly interred in a Lexington cemetery, and the cave entrance was sealed with concrete as part of the highway construction project. Dr. Rebecca Torres, now a professor at the University of Kentucky, continued to investigate similar cases throughout the 1990s. Her research identified at least 17 other documented disappearances at mineral springs sites across Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia between 1875 and 1885. In each case, the pattern was the same. Small groups of people seeking medical treatment at remote springs would vanish without explanation, leaving behind no trace, except for abandoned belongings and local stories of strange underground voices. What troubled Torres most was the realization that these disappearances had occurred during a specific 10-year period when industrial mining operations were beginning to penetrate deeper into the Appalachian cave systems. Her hypothesis was that mining activities had destabilized underground water tables, causing dangerous concentrations of dissolved minerals to emerge at natural springs that had previously been safe for human use. But even this rational explanation could not account for the most disturbing aspect of the Millfield Springs case. The fact that similar reports continued to emerge well into the 20th century. In 1923, a family of 5 disappeared while camping near a mineral spring in eastern Tennessee. Their bodies were found 6 months later in an underground cave, perfectly preserved by calcium carbonate deposits and arranged in the same circular pattern around an underground pool. In 1951, 3 University of Kentucky geology students vanished while conducting research at a mineral spring in Breathitt County. Their remains were discovered in 1983 when road construction uncovered a previously unknown cave system. Like the earlier victims, their bodies showed signs of rapid mineral deposition and were positioned around an underground water source. The most recent documented case occurred in 1987, just months before Torres began her research. A couple from Ohio, seeking alternative treatment for the woman's bone cancer, disappeared while visiting a private mineral spring resort in Bell County, Kentucky. Their bodies were never found, but hikers reported hearing voices echoing from underground chambers near the spring site for weeks after their disappearance. Torres' final research paper, published in 2001, presented a comprehensive analysis of what she termed the Kentucky Springs phenomenon. Her conclusion was that certain geological conditions in Appalachian cave systems could create concentrated mineral solutions that were lethal to humans, and that underground water currents could transport bodies to cave chambers that were difficult or impossible to access from the surface. But Torres also acknowledged that her research had raised more questions than it answered. The consistent pattern of the disappearances, the precise positioning of the remains, and the accounts of underground voices suggested that something more complex than simple mineral poisoning was occurring at these sites. What Torres never published, but confided to close colleagues before her retirement in 2015, was her growing conviction that the Millfield Springs case represented something beyond conventional scientific explanation. The evidence suggested that certain underground water systems in Kentucky possessed properties that could fundamentally alter human tissue in ways that violated everything known about chemistry and biology. More disturbing was Torres' discovery that many of the affected spring sites remained active, continuing to attract visitors who were unaware of their history. Her final interviews, conducted with elderly residents of Wolfe County, revealed that people still disappeared near mineral springs throughout eastern Kentucky, but that these incidents were rarely reported or investigated due to the remote locations and the reluctance of local authorities to acknowledge patterns they could not explain. As I researched this story, I found myself confronting the same questions that haunted Dr. Torres throughout her career. How do we explain documented historical events that challenge our understanding of natural law? What do we do with evidence that suggests the boundaries between the living and the mineral world are not as absolute as we believe? The official records tell us that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell and his 28 patients died in a tragic accident involving exposure to dangerous mineral concentrations in underground cave water. The scientific explanation is rational, well documented, and consistent with known geological processes. But the unofficial records, the accounts passed down through generations of Kentucky mountain families, the stories told by hunters and hikers who have encountered unexplained phenomena near old spring sites, the reports of voices echoing from underground chambers where no living person should be able to survive. These records tell a different story. They tell of places where the earth itself seems to hunger for human contact, where the promise of healing becomes a trap that transforms the living into monuments of stone, where the boundary between flesh and mineral dissolves in waters that remember every soul they have claimed. Tonight, as you consider this story, I want you to think about the nature of healing and the price we're willing to pay for it. In 1880, 29 desperate people traveled to the remote hills of Kentucky, seeking relief from their suffering. They found something there that changed them in ways they never could have imagined. The question that haunts me is whether they found what they were looking for. Were those 29 stone figures trapped in eternal suffering, Or had they achieved a kind of immortality that transcended the pain of their mortal flesh? In the deep places beneath the Kentucky mountains, where underground waters flow through limestone chambers that have never seen sunlight, that question remains unanswered. The springs still flow, the caves still echo with sounds that might be wind or might be voices, and somewhere in the darkness, 29 figures stand in their perfect circle, frozen in stone, waiting for someone to understand what they became. If you're ever traveling through eastern Kentucky and you come across a clear spring bubbling up from limestone bedrock, remember the story of Millfield Springs. Remember that healing comes in many forms, and that some transformations are more permanent than we could ever imagine. What do you think happened to Dr. Hartwell and his patients? Do you believe Jacob Mill's account of what he found in that underground chamber? Or do you think there's a more conventional explanation for this mystery? I'd love to hear your theories in the comments below. And if this story has left you wondering about the other dark secrets hidden in America's medical history, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We dive deep into the cases that traditional historians prefer to forget, the medical mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the limits of science and human experience. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly buried. Sometimes it's just waiting beneath the surface, preserved in stone, ready to remind us that there are still mysteries in this world that defy explanation. The healing waters of Millfield Springs claimed 29 souls in 1880. How many more are they waiting to claim? Sweet dreams. 300 miles north of Millfield Springs, in the bustling industrial city of Cincinnati, Ohio, stood one of the most progressive medical institutions of the Victorian era. St. Agatha's Hospital for Women and Children was a gleaming testament to modern medicine. Its white limestone facade and towering spires dominating the skyline of the city's medical district. But in the basement of St. Agatha's, beneath the polished floors and gaslit corridors where well-dressed physicians made their rounds, something unspeakable was growing. It began with Dr. Elias Whitmore's obsession with the Millfield Springs disappearances. Dr. Whitmore had been a colleague of Dr. Cornelius Hartwell at Harvard Medical School, and when news of Hartwell's vanishing reached Cincinnati in November 1880, Whitmore became consumed with understanding what had happened to his former classmate. Through connections in the Kentucky medical community, Whitmore obtained samples of the Millfield Springs water and began conducting his own experiments. What he discovered would transform him from a respected pediatrician into something far more sinister. Whitmore's private journals, discovered in 1923 when St. Agatha's was demolished, reveal a physician whose scientific curiosity had evolved into dangerous obsession. His early entries describe standard chemical analysis of the spring water, but by December 1880, his research had taken a decidedly darker turn. December 15, 1880. The mineral composition of Hartwell's water samples defies conventional analysis. When introduced to human bone tissue, the solution appears to accelerate calcium absorption at rates that should be physiologically impossible. I have begun to wonder if the key to understanding this phenomenon lies not in the water itself, but in the specific conditions under which it interacts with living tissue. December 22, 1880. I have procured fresh cadaver specimens from the city morgue for further testing. The results are extraordinary. When bones are soaked in the Millfield solution for extended periods, they become harder than marble, yet retain their organic structure. Most remarkable, when I tested the solution on living tissue samples, the transformation occurs at 10 times the rate observed in dead tissue. By January 1881, Dr. Whitmore had moved beyond laboratory experiments to direct human trials. St. Agatha's Hospital served Cincinnati's most vulnerable population: orphan children, destitute women, and patients whose families could not afford private medical care. These were people whose disappearances would barely be noticed, whose deaths could be easily attributed to the diseases and conditions that had brought them to the hospital in the first place. Whitmore began by selecting patients with severe bone diseases: children with rickets, elderly women with advanced osteoporosis, accident victims whose bones had been shattered beyond conventional repair. To these desperate souls, he offered a revolutionary new treatment based on mineral therapy techniques developed at Kentucky Healing Springs. The treatment involved daily injections of a solution derived from the Millfield Springs water, combined with extended immersion in mineral baths that Whitmore had constructed in the hospital's basement. Patients were told they were participating in cutting-edge medical research that could revolutionize the treatment of bone diseases. What actually happened in those basement chambers was documented in horrifying detail in Whitmore's private notes. January 28, 1881. Patient number 3, Mary Sullivan, age 12, suffering from severe rickets. Fourth day of treatment. Bone density measurements show remarkable improvement, but the child complains of severe pain and stiffness in her joints. Her skin has taken on an unusual gray pallor, and she appears to be having difficulty moving. Most concerning, when I touch her arms, they feel unnaturally hard, as if the muscles themselves are beginning to calcify. February 2, 1881. Patient number 3 expired during the night. Post-mortem examination reveals complete ossification of muscle tissue throughout her body. Her bones have achieved a density comparable to granite, but the transformation appears to have extended to all soft tissues. The child's body is now essentially a perfect skeleton encased in calcified flesh. Most remarkable, her facial expression suggests she remained conscious throughout the final stages of the transformation. By March 1881, Whitmore had moved 17 patients to the basement treatment rooms. None had returned to the hospital's general population, but Dr. Whitmore was no longer content with simply observing the transformation process. His journal entries from spring 1881 reveal a physician who had crossed the line between medical research and something far more disturbing. March 15, 1881. I have begun to arrange the completed specimens in systematic displays within the basement chambers. Each figure represents a different stage of the ossification process, creating a comprehensive catalog of how the human form responds to mineral saturation. The collection is becoming quite beautiful in its own way, a garden of bone and stone that demonstrates the ultimate perfection of the human skeleton. March 20th, 1881. I find myself spending increasing amounts of time among my specimens. They seem to possess a peace that the living can never achieve, freed from pain, from disease, from the constant struggle against mortality. I begin to understand what Hartwell may have discovered at Millfield Springs. Perhaps what appeared to be a tragedy was actually a form of transcendence. Whitmore's bone garden continued to grow throughout 1881. He became increasingly selective in his choice of patients, focusing on children and young adults whose bone structure would create the most aesthetically pleasing specimens. Each victim was carefully positioned during their final transformation, their bodies arranged to create elaborate tableaux that Whitmore photographed with the primitive camera equipment of the era. The photographs, found decades later in a sealed vault beneath the demolished hospital, show dozens of calcified human figures arranged in poses that suggest a macabre ballet, frozen in time. Children reaching toward the ceiling with arms raised in supplication. Women kneeling in prayer, their faces turned upward, toward an unseen salvation. Young men posed as if running, their legs mid-stride, their expressions captured in permanent terror. By autumn 1881, Whitmore's activities had attracted the attention of hospital administrators. Patients admitted to St. Agatha's were disappearing at an alarming rate, and families were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about their missing relatives. The investigation began when Mrs. Catherine O'Brien, a wealthy Cincinnati widow, demanded to know what had happened to her nephew, Timothy, who had been admitted to St. Agatha's for treatment of a broken leg in August 1881. Timothy had written to his aunt regularly during his first week at the hospital, but his letters had stopped abruptly, and hospital staff claimed to have no record of his discharge. Mrs. O'Brien hired private investigator Marcus Doyle to look into her nephew's disappearance. Doyle's investigation, preserved in his detailed case files, uncovered a pattern of missing patients that stretched back to the beginning of the year. October 10, 1881. Interview with hospital orderly. James McKenna reveals disturbing information about Dr. Whitmore's basement activities. McKenna claims that patients selected for special treatment are taken to basement rooms that are kept locked at all times. He has observed Dr. Whitmore making frequent trips to these rooms, often carrying photographic equipment and what appear to be positioning devices. Most troubling, McKenna reports hearing screaming from the basement rooms that continues for days before suddenly stopping. October 12, 1881. Attempted to gain access to hospital basement but was prevented by Dr. Whitmore personally, he claims. The basement houses delicate medical equipment that cannot be disturbed. His manner was extremely agitated, and I noted that his hands showed signs of prolonged exposure to chemical solution skin. Discoloration and unusual hardening of the fingernails that suggests mineral absorption. Doyle's investigation was cut short on October 15, 1881, when he was found dead in his Cincinnati office. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the private physician who examined the body noted unusual mineral deposits in Doyle's blood and organs that suggested poisoning by unknown chemical agents. Mrs. O'Brien, frightened by the investigator's death, took her suspicions directly to the Cincinnati Police Department. But when officers arrived at St. Agatha's Hospital on October 20, 1881, they found the basement treatment rooms empty and Dr. Whitmore gone. What they did find, hidden behind a false wall in the hospital's sub-basement, was Whitmore's bone garden in all its horrible glory. The police report, filed by Detective Captain William Morse, described a chamber containing 43 human figures transformed into calcified statues. Each figure was positioned with careful attention to artistic composition, and each bore brass nameplate identifying the victim and the date of their transformation. Timothy O'Brien was there, posed as if writing a letter, his calcified hand still holding a pen made of hardened bone. Mary Sullivan, the 12-year-old girl with rickets, knelt in the center of the display with her arms spread wide, her face turned upward in an expression of desperate hope. Dozens of other children and young adults filled the chamber, their stone faces bearing witness to their final moments of consciousness as their bodies hardened around them.